In the past 2 weeks, I can guarantee you've met somebody who could be considered a goth, or at the very least somebody who is so down bad for goth women it left you a little bit worried and apathetic. There's a reason for this. Goth fashion has become one of the more popular music-based styles of fashion in recent years, with every teenage girl being presented with the choice between becoming a goth or a Taylor Swift stan. What many individuals don't realise is the modern representation of goth fashion is extremely far removed from what it originally looked like. For example, you don't see any trendy e-girls rocking this trim nowadays, which is kind of fair. I don't even know how the f you'd get that trim to begin with. My point is, the fashion and subculture of goth has evolved tremendously since Susie and the Banshees in the 70s, and has morphed from a mysterious, almost looked down upon dress code to what is essentially a multi-million-dollar industry that thrives on the promise that everyone can look different and unique by wearing the exact same clothes in the exact same colour. Obviously, this level of popularity has to correlate with something that's extremely appealing to a widespread, diverse group of people. In order to understand these appeals, we need to go back to the birth of what could be considered goth fashion. Your brain synapses are probably buzzing away with bands like Susie and the Banshees and The Cure bouncing from one side of your head to the other. Hold your horses. Aspects of goth fashion can realistically be dated back to about 100 years before the formation of these bands. Some of you may be thinking Gothic art dates back to the 12th century, and to that I would say this video is about fashion and not. The mid to late Victorian era would become hugely inspirational to the goths of the future, but of course it was only the depressing specifically the mourning dress code would be utilised, and by mourning I mean and not. Essentially, if a woman were to lose somebody extremely close to them, they would enter a period of mourning, symbolised by a specific dress code. The clothing would differ depending on who passed away and their relation to the person mourning, and would even begin to develop and change in fabric and style as the mourning would continue. Many aspects of this style of dress would go on to influence goth, including frills, bonnets, ruffles, and of course black. Other elements of Victorian fashion outside of the mourning period would become inspirational, such as corsets, dark lace, high boots, and pale skin. Other time periods in history that would preface the goth movement in the 70s would be the popularity of vampire films in the early 1900s, specifically films featuring the femme fatale archetype, essentially a mysterious, beautiful and seductive woman who leads unsuspecting men into traps. Although this character has been prevalent in Western culture since the Middle Ages, it wouldn't become influential to modern culture and fashion until the 1915 film A Fool There Was, featuring Theda Bara as the vampire. Bara is said to be one of the earliest sex symbols in cinema and would don a lot of the future gothic staples in many of her films. Specifically, the dark makeup worn by Bara directly inspired what goths of the 70s would lather all over their face. Although the origin of the word goth dates back to the Roman Empire, what we're talking about in this video has literally nothing to do with. The original use of the term that's more akin to the modern subculture would be 18th century gothic literature, which included themes of horror, morbidity and darkness. All this including and inspired the post-punk scene in the late 70s. Motherfuckers were sick of power chords, and instead of being first wave puberty levels of angry, bands within the scene were a lot more mournful and depressing. The first use of the word goth in terms of music is said to have described Joy Division, with their manager labelling them as gothic in comparison to the pop mainstream. Bands like Susie and the Banshees, Bauhaus and The Cure would join Joy Division in this early post-punk / goth scene, with the bands focusing on a softer melodic style, although similarly to punk still had a tendency towards rebellion through imagery. Bands would create a distinct dramatic visual style, specifically purchasing clothing from the generations prior for a cheaper price. The bands also began to introduce elements of androgyny into the mix, with clothes being very similar for both genders, allowing individuals to explore fashion and style more independently and freely. Bauhaus are commonly considered as the originators of the goth style, with the single Bela Lugosi's Dead, released in 1979, featuring macabre, eerie vocals alongside the dark androgynous style of dress that would go on to categorise a lot of goth fashion. This may be the case, but it's difficult not to attribute a lot of its popularity and influence to Susie Sue of Susie and the Banshees, who took the DIY look of punk beforehand and added a sense of androgyny alongside lace, fishnets and unique abstract silhouettes. Susie showed the masses that individuality and creativity reigned supreme when it came to fashion. 1982 would see the opening of the underground club named the Batcave. This would see many of the bands labelled as positive punk and later goth perform. This allowed the bands to connect on a personal level to the fans of their music, creating a location that allowed the style to thrive into a subculture. Dark femininity would begin to spread as a popular style of dress throughout the next couple of years. Prominent bands like Sisters of Mercy would introduce elements of pointed boots and the skinniest jeans you have probably ever seen. As the 80s trudged along and eventually came to a close, many of the gothic bands would begin to fade into obscurity in the mainstream, resulting in many of the pioneers either breaking up or altering their style. This began to dampen the outlandish elements of the style, and of course, watered down anything that was left for one thing and one thing only. The 90s would see the development of mall culture, with shops beginning to open, specifically targeting the alternative clothing market. Hot Topic would open in 1987, taking elements of the goth culture and fashion, manufacturing it as cheap as humanly possible, and slapping a price tag on it, opening the style to individuals who were either unaware of the culture or not willing to participate in the individuality of the style beforehand. Spencer's Gifts would enter the mall in 1990, again selling aspects of goth fashion, only this time mass-produced. Even brands like Claire's would begin focusing on dark alternative jewellery. The popularity of specifically the mall goth style would develop further, with artists like Marilyn Manson and the explosion of nu metal influencing the style greatly. Checkered print, chunky sneakers, combat boots, stripes, this thing, you know the drill. If you're thinking this looks nothing like this, that sentiment was shared by individuals who were still enthralled by the original message and style of goth. Mall goth began to receive a negative connotation. They were seen as individuals only interested in the scene for the image, rarely actually listening or even being aware of the bands and icons that came beforehand. It was no longer really goth, it was just a combination of everything considered popular or trendy at the time and alternative culture, mashed together in a big pot by large corporations and sold for a cheap price tag, which in turn is obviously going to influence and appeal to a much wider audience than Joy Division fans. A wider appeal means more individuals with differing interests were attached to elements of goth, which began to develop a few distinct styles that differ greatly from traditional goths. One of which being cybergoth. This style of dress would develop in Germany in the 90s, as the youth began becoming enamoured with electronic music as opposed to alternative rock and punk. This in turn led them to take elements of rave culture and fashion and introduce them into the goth formula. Essentially, if you want to dress like a cybergoth, take a Victorian lady, splatter them with neon paint and send them through some sort of time paradox that attaches the worst elements of fashion within each era of history to their body. Also, since it's the rave scene, essentially remove all of these elements in order to show as much skin as possible. Another style of goth that emerged in the 90s would be the romantic goth. This style essentially takes all the more macabre elements of goth and pushes it to its absolute limit. More so inspired by traditional gothic literature and the mourning dress mentioned earlier, they essentially just look ripped straight out of the Victorian era, wearing some of the most inconvenient clothing I've ever seen. There's also a substyle named Victorian goth, which is apparently different but pretty much looks identical to me. And of course, as we move into the modern day, people are too busy to lace up knee-high boots or tie up corsets. This style is known as casual goth, and it's the one that's most prominently seen today. It essentially involves incorporating goth elements into everyday fashion, which I suppose is the less cringe version of the mall goth. You'll most commonly see individuals looking like this, just taking the less cumbersome elements of the style and incorporating it in the most aesthetic way possible. Obviously, as soon as something is labelled as casual, it's pretty much cemented in the mainstream culture, and although many of the individuals who are labelled as having a goth dress code don't really look anything like the originators or even the earliest influences, there are still many people who subscribe to that exact same style and culture seen in the late 70s. Goth festivals are hosted all around the world, allowing for the celebration of the most outlandish and macabre elements of the fashion. The influence has even extended to high fashion, with elements of the most uncomfortable sides of the style being used on models, or how I describe it, AIs walking down a catwalk. Despite all of this, the term goth for the younger generation has been skewed a bit. If you say goth to a zoomer, they'll immediately think big titty goth GF, or the e-girl wearing black that recently fried their pleasure receptors on TikTok. Although it's very easy to look upon this fact and criticise the watering down of an entire subculture for online popularity, in reality it's the same as it's always been, using fashion to make a statement to be different, even though nowadays they're doing it online for validation as opposed to pushing boundaries, and they're actually not different because they're just following trends and everybody else is... For f***ing sake, I swear I try, but I can never end any of these videos on a positive note.